Hello again, this is Jim McDermott. This is the final part of the talks we're giving in the Collin District. And we're trying to look at how things have changed. This is Cluna House, and it stands in the Cluna estate. Now, it had many owners in its time. It was in 6 acres of land, but it was built originally by one of the big central families, the development of Belfast. That's the Grimshaws. I'll go back and look at the picture first. It's a very poor picture of great Beatrice Grimshaw again, for which I apologise. But going back to Cluna House. It was built by the Grimshaw family, who had originally came across from Preston, and they had been cotton manufacturers. They seemed to have been a very enterprising family. The Grimshaws, well, they were a well-connected family too. They were first cousins of the Peel family, of whom Sir Robert Peel, who formed the constabulary, the Peelers, was Chief Secretary of Ireland. But they had come over long before he became Chief Secretary, in the middle of the 18th century. They had come over to help give a trade in handloom weaving to the children in the current Clifton House, which had been set up about 1776 or so. But they stayed and they used the fast streams, just like the Charlie family had done, just like the Barbers and others, to set up linen manufacture. Originally at Greencastle, then at White House, they lived in various places, including Trench House for a time, after the passing of the last of the line of the Hamill family. But this particular house was built in 1867 by Nicholas Grimshaw. Of course, there was no estate around it then. It had its own swimming pool, its own glass houses, building different types of food. There were ponies and stuff like that. And really, the family were quite big in Belfast. They were into banking, they were into insurance, they diversified into many things. Even the famous Ulster Bank building, which is now the Merchant in Waring Street, if you go down, it was built as a bank originally, and the original one of the original bank board was a Nicholas Grimshaw, who fell down the steps and the door opened, getting killed. When a very, very prominent family in all respects. Had they been in England, would have been Gladstone Liberals. Here they were quite liberal anyway, regarded as good employers and so on. Generally, though, they took an establishment line, except for this lady. Now, she's hard to see very clearly in this picture, but this is Beatrice Grimshaw. And she would have been very, very well known to writers at one time in the Belfast area. She was very much her own lady. She was one of 4 sisters, one of whom would have lived in Stranmillis House. She was married to William Murphy, who owned it in the present Training College building. But she herself was independent-minded. Although she was very well educated, that hopes actually she would be a translator. She had been at Queen's University and so on. She had been at Victoria College. She was regarded as a very bright, scholarly lady. She very much loved living in her autobiographical pieces in the Cluna House area. She regarded herself as the rebellious Grimshaw, the one who wouldn't conform. And she was really editing sports magazines, taking part in 24-hour cycle races, which broke a world record by 5 hours, in every respect insisting she go her own way. Although she'd been at French finishing school and so on, she decided she would do what she considered important with her own life, regarded as a blue stocking in many ways. This is another picture of her. At her pump, this would have been taken when she was around 30 to 30 before she left Ireland altogether. After she lived in Dublin for a time, she decided that she wanted to see much more of the world. And she went to the South Sea Islands, to places that not only had no white woman ever stood before, but no white man had either. She lived in the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, all around that sort of area, where she owned plantations. She managed plantations. She met witch doctors, headhunters. She evaded death just about. And she wrote about this, not only in novels, but also in travelogues. And she was one of the most widely read lady writers of her generation, dying in Bathurst at the age of 83 in 1950s. She wrote, for example, in the 1920s, when there was 1930s, I beg your pardon, after the Wall Street crash, when writers found it difficult to get an assignment or get their books sold because there was poverty. She was paid £1,000 for an article by the New York Post, $1,000, beg your pardon. And her books were never out of print for 40 years. She was still connected to Colin of Cluna House, of course. And when she died in Bathurst, New South Wales in 1953, they found a picture of Cluna House underneath her undergarment. She kept it close to her heart. But the books that she wrote, which can be accessed on the internet, I have never read them, but I'll just read you some of their titles. Her books include travelogues and so on. And she wrote them at a period when Ireland was in full change. From the period of the formation of the Ulster Unionist Council in Sinn Féin 1905, right up until the advent of the Second World War, when Ireland was partitioned, when you had a massive war of independence, when you had the Irish Civil War, when you had loads of trouble in Belfast. She was out writing travelogues as well as books like, and I'll read you some of the titles: The Savage South Seas, 1907. From Fiji to the Cannibal Islands, 1907. The New Guinea, 1912. Guinea Gold, 1914. The Soldier's Stone, 1914. Nobody's Islet, 1916. The Coral Queen, 1919. The Coral Palace, 1921. Victoria Family Robinson in 1934, and my particular favourite title, South Sea Sarah in 1940. Now this lady was obviously sort of very, very active, and her obituary was actually printed in the New York Times. But she seems to have been afflicted with untreated diabetes, which gave her amnesia, and her own fortune was never sort of bequeathed to anyone. But she's buried, really a forgotten figure in some respects, but an aspect of Church of Ireland originally actually converted to Catholicism, but an aspect of sort of life in the area which is easily forgotten. And there's memoirs to her in Cluna House to the present time, which of course there should be. This is Beatrice Grimshaw in old age, very much matronly looking, very much her own lady, even looking at that picture, to her dying day. She was a very sort of formidable lady, refused to have anything to do with books that were in any way salacious, very much, I suppose, a thinking woman, but very attached emotionally to the Cluna area. Would have been part of the great social life of Big House in the time. Would have been at Woodburn and so on, Glenville, Conway House, Faith House, Finnicky House, Mossville, all the sort of the big houses along the stretch of the Andersonstown Road now, which at one time wouldn't have names, treetops and so on. but wouldn't have had, sorry, I beg your pardon, wouldn't have had numbers as in the Andy Turn Road today, but rather would have been a part of a nucleated agricultural area largely. The land use would have been devoted to agriculture, the production of flax, and in turn its transport for production into linen in the huge mills in Belfast. So she's part of a time in many, many respects. And she bears contrast to another very interesting and independent-minded person. Before we go to him, I just want to point out that this is the Turf Lodge farm, from which a photograph of the McGill family, and it's from this that Turf Lodge area was named after. They were a big family that lived up near enough beside the Windy Gap. Still to this day, the McGill is very, very active, keeping the portrait by the drawing taken by photograph from a drawing taken by Vincent Gargan. Very, very interested in the development of Hannistown and the nationalist areas generally. Father O'Donnell, who opened Old St Mary's, also opened St Joseph's in Hannistown. This character too is an interesting man. He wrote his own autobiography, which I couldn't access because this pandemic is on. I couldn't get my hands on it, though I'm familiar with it. An Unquiet Life. But this book details an aspect of his life which I believe formed him. The Partridge Road is named after him, and rightly so, because his humanitarian contribution, not just to Belfast, which thanks to him was the safest place to have a heart attack, not only in Ireland but in the world, is down to this one very unique thinking individual. The picture in the front shows Frank Partridge as a Japanese prisoner of war and inventor of the portable defibrillator. I think both events are linked. The fact that he was a prisoner of war was to influence him, was to give him a regard for human life. If you look across from the picture, it shows a group of doctors treating a patient in the Japanese camps like Shanghai during that Second World War, which was to influence his view that human life was sacrosanct. It was primary, that everything should be done by a doctor to prolong that life, that it wasn't just a job, you went beyond the extra mile. And in front of him in that picture, there's a military cross. He was awarded it for his service to prisoners during the Second World War in the Japanese camps. He has got a portable defibrillator for which today he is so rightly famous. His statue is outside today, outside Lisburn's Civic Centre, and he's associated with life out there, though his home was in the Collin district. He bought a house of a fellow doctor, and he, before the estates were built for Polglass, that's where he lived. It's what he identified with. It's where he was happy. He never married, I think largely due to the consequences, the emotional consequences of what he went through in the First World War. But he was local, all right. He was actually born in Hillsborough, on a farm that just overlooked Hillsborough Castle, where the Good Friday Agreement was to be signed later. He went to school locally, and secondary school was actually Friends School in Lisburn, which had originally been formed by the Quakers like Hogg and Hancock. It was of a liberal mindset, and I think he acquired that. Although he could be very testy in some respects in later life, certainly very quirky, he didn't like to be told what to do. He went his own way. But there is not the remotest inclination, or indication rather, of sectarianism in him. As a young boy, in his friend's college uniform, he was hit and punched in the face by a large older boy, a Catholic boy with a different school uniform. And asked later on, did it affect him? He said no. He had a scientific mindset. He always wanted to be a doctor. And he could see that he couldn't see what religion made to a person's mindset or thinking and potential. It's one of those things that simply didn't arrive on his radar. So that didn't concern him. He was a practitioner of medicine, going to the Royal Victoria Hospital quite early, about 1938. Now, it only went to the Victoria Hospital in 1938 when, shortly after it, he got an internship after serving as a locum doctor out in Comber for a time. And this is what he's famous for, the portable defibrillator. Because while he was at, as a young intern, in the Royal Victoria Hospital, he fell off his chair. He had took diphtheria. And they examined him and they found that his heart had an irregular heartbeat. Now, he was lucky because that happened in the hospital itself. It was acknowledged for a long time after the work of Swiss doctors and so on, that if you could get the heart moving by an electric shock treatment, it would rectify itself and you could live. So he must have had an early interest in heart treatments, both personally but definitely later on as a consequence of his suffering in the Great War. This is him as an older man. But in 1940, when the Great War broke out, by temperament he would have been deeply opposed to the Axis powers anyway of Germany, Italy and Japan. Fascism he would have been naturally opposed to. But he volunteered for service as a military officer. He was lucky in one sense that he was to be sent to Norway and they wouldn't send him because he couldn't ski. But the medical group that were sent all lost their lives. He was later posted to Singapore, which was regarded as a sort of plum posting. It was Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister's belief that there would be no trouble in Singapore or Malaya. Although the Japanese had been expanding in that area, they'd actually been at war from 1931 with China. But by 1941, the Japanese were running short of the very important raw materials of tin and rubber. Malaya gave 30% of the world's tin and produced 30% of the world's tin, 40% of the world's rubber. And you needed those if you were to go to war. You also needed petroleum. In 1941 in December, the Japanese launched an attack on Pearl Harbor, opening up a war where they'd eyed very carefully French, Dutch and British possessions in the Far East. Churchill didn't believe they would go near Singapore. Singapore was one of the jewels in the crown of what was left of the British Empire at that stage. 25% of the wealth of the whole British Empire passed through Singapore. The harbour, costing them £25 million, was a massive affair, great for trade and so on. And originally when they were sent there, they thought, well, this will be fine. You know, it will not be a difficult posting. The person in charge of it actually, Percival, in charge of the British there, the British Army officer General Percival, had been in Ireland And he sort of said, it'd been over during the war of 1920 to 22 and that, 1919 to 21 in Ireland. He was posted in Cork, actually, at the time of the war there against Ballyshancolm and so on. And he said, look, we'll have no trouble from the Japanese. They're quite small people. They'll not attack us. They attack them, okay. Singapore fell very, very quickly. The Japanese acted with incredible brutality. They had a sort of different mindset to the way war should be conducted. Although they're remarkably civilised people today. But it left an awful mark on people like Dr. Frank Partridge and the 130,000 odd troops which surrendered in Singapore and were taken with him. He was brought to Changi prison, marched 120 miles with the other prisoners, and put in a place where medical facilities were low. Food was so meagre as to leave the men emaciated, and disease was common. You're talking about malaria, cholera, beriberi, all sorts of tropical diseases with no medicine to serve them, without adequate bandages and so on. People like Dr. Frank Partridge served with great distinction, with make, do and mend, making tropical medicines out of local materials, using uniforms to cut up their own bandages. And this situation got even worse when he was moved out to the famous Thai-Burma Railway, made famous in Bridge over the River Kwai. Suffered awfully, almost died himself. Discovered, of course, that heart treatment was a big killer in different diseases. Was glad, it must be said, to see the end of the war, with the horrible bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but was glad to get back to Belfast where he resumed his medical studies. War had taught him a lot. In 1792 he discovered that field hospitals in the Napoleonic Wars, as long as they went to the front early, could save life. And one of his discoveries was that for every minute lost between getting defibrillator in use to a person who had a heart attack, there was about 100,000 heart attacks per year in 1962, of which a third roughly of people died from it. And the sooner you could get them to hospital, the better chances of survival was. 10% for every minute. And he invented a portable defibrillator where you could get immediate treatment. And this was to have a revolutionary effect. He served in the hospital. He was very dedicated to his task. He was asked what's the most common question you are asked by a patient, and he says, will I die, doctor? His reply was always the same: yes, you will die, so will I. The question is when. My job is to keep you alive for as long as I can. And he did that remarkably well. And for it and his selflessness, the poet Seamus Heaney, who got the Nobel Prize for Literature and who taught for a time, he was from Ballachy and Derry, but he taught in St Thomas's School, my old alma mater. And he had a very, very bad heart attack, and he was saved by the defibrillator, the portable defibrillator, which could be moved in ambulances and so on, going to the patient. He was saved by this, and he woke up famously saying, blessed be the pacemakers. So this is a man with a massive contribution, not only to local history. It was not, Ireland was the easiest place to have, Belfast probably, easiest place to have a heart attack in all the world at one stage, as defibrillators used throughout the world. Lyndon B. Johnson, who was President of the United States of America, stated, I owe my life to an Irish Japanese prisoner of war who saved it. When I had his heart attack, it was a defibrillator developed by Partridge which saved him, and he's right. He's an example of the unheralded gifts that the Cullen area have given, not just to its own locality, but the world in general. Thank you.